Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome once again to another thrilling adventure with that debonair gentleman of mystery, Simon Templar, better known to Scotland Yard and criminals alike as the Saint. Tonight's tale takes us to a fog-shrouded evening in London, where the whir of helicopter blades cuts through the autumn mist like a knife through silk. It was October of 1948 when our story begins, and the Saint found himself drawn into one of the most peculiar cases of his distinguished career. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the amber glow of gas lamps, when a most unusual visitor arrived at Simon's flat in Piccadilly.
The visitor was Professor Edmund Newdick, a brilliant but eccentric inventor whose reputation preceded him like the scent of ozone before a thunderstorm. Newdick had spent the better part of 2 decades perfecting what he claimed would revolutionize transportation forever, a helicopter of his own design, capable of silent flight and remarkable maneuverability. But on this particular evening, as he sat across from the Saint in that familiar sitting room, his hands trembled not with excitement over his invention, but with fear. "Templar," the professor said, his voice barely above a whisper, "my helicopter has been stolen, but that's not the worst of it. The man who took it has vanished completely, along with something far more valuable than the machine itself."
Simon Templar leaned back in his leather chair, those keen blue eyes studying the professor's weathered face with the intensity of a jeweler examining a precious stone. The Saint had encountered many desperate men in his time, but there was something different about Newdick's fear. It was the kind of terror that comes not from physical danger, but from the knowledge that one has unleashed something beyond their control. "Tell me about this pilot of yours, Professor," the Saint said, his voice carrying that familiar note of calm authority that had steadied nerves from Mayfair to Monte Carlo. Outside, the fog seemed to press against the windows like ghostly fingers, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of rotor blades echoed through the night.
Professor Newdick's story unfolded like pages from a Gothic novel, each detail more intriguing than the last. The pilot, a man named Charles Weatherby, had appeared at Newdick's laboratory 3 months earlier, claiming to be a former Royal Air Force officer with extensive experience in experimental aircraft. His credentials were impeccable, his references unquestionable, and his enthusiasm for the helicopter project seemed genuine. "He understood the machine better than I dared hope," Newdick explained, wringing his hands nervously. Within weeks, he was performing test flights that would have challenged pilots with years of experience. But yesterday, when I arrived at the hangar, both Weatherby and the helicopter were gone. The night watchman remembers nothing, and there were no signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air.
The Saint's interest was thoroughly piqued, as it always was when presented with a puzzle that seemed to defy logical explanation. He had built his reputation on solving the impossible, on finding truth in the shadows where ordinary minds saw only darkness. "You mentioned something more valuable than the helicopter itself, Professor," the Saint inquired with that characteristic tilt of his head. "What exactly are we talking about?" Newdick's face grew even paler, if such a thing were possible, and he glanced nervously toward the window, as if expecting to see watching eyes peering through the fog. Hidden within the helicopter's engine compartment are the complete plans for a new type of aircraft engine, one that could change the course of aviation history, he whispered. "If those plans fell into the wrong hands, Templar, the consequences could be catastrophic."
The morning brought no relief from the fog that had settled over London like a gray blanket, but it did bring the Saint to Professor Newdick's laboratory on the outskirts of the city. The building stood alone among empty fields, its windows dark and unwelcoming in the pale dawn light. Inside, Newdick led the saint through corridors lined with half-finished inventions and mysterious contraptions, each one a testament to the professor's brilliant but scattered mind. The hangar where the helicopter had been housed was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadows above. Oil stains on the concrete floor marked where the aircraft had once stood, and the lingering scent of aviation fuel hung in the air like an accusation. Weatherby knew this place better than anyone except myself, Newdick said sadly. He had access to everything, complete freedom to work. I trusted him completely.
The saint's practiced eye took in every detail of the hangar, searching for clues that might have escaped the attention of the local constabulary. It was then that he noticed something peculiar. A small piece of paper wedged beneath a tool cabinet, so inconspicuous that it might have been overlooked entirely. The paper bore a hastily scrawled address in East London, along with what appeared to be a date and time. "Professor," the saint said, holding up his discovery with the satisfaction of a magician revealing his trick, "does this mean anything to you?" Newdick examined the paper carefully, his bushy eyebrows furrowing with concentration. "That's Weatherby's handwriting," he confirmed, his voice growing troubled. "But I've never seen this address before. It's in Whitechapel, in one of the old warehouse districts. But why would he go there?" The saint smiled that enigmatic smile that had become his trademark. "Perhaps, my dear professor, it's time we paid a visit to find out."
The journey to Whitechapel took the saint and Professor Newdick through the heart of London's East End, where narrow streets wound between towering warehouses like arteries through an industrial heart. The fog seemed even thicker here, muffling sound and creating an atmosphere of almost supernatural eeriness. Their taxi deposited them before a massive brick building that clearly seen better days, its windows boarded up and its walls stained with decades of soot and neglect. "This is it," the saint murmured, consulting the scrap of paper once more. "But I confess, Professor, I'm beginning to suspect that your Mr. Weatherby may not be quite who he claimed to be." As if summoned by his words, the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors suddenly filled the air above them, growing louder with each passing second.
The fog parted like a curtain as the helicopter descended, its sleek form materializing from the gray mist with an almost supernatural grace. Even in the dim light, the saint could see that this was indeed no ordinary aircraft. Professor Newdick's genius was evident in every line of his revolutionary design. The machine settled onto the flat roof of the warehouse with barely a whisper, and a figure emerged from the cockpit with the fluid movements of a born aviator. "Weatherby," Professor Newdick breathed, but the saint had already noticed something the professor had missed. The man approaching them was not Charles Weatherby at all, but someone entirely different, someone whose face the saint recognized from police files and newspaper photographs. "Ladies and gentlemen," the saint said quietly to his companion, "allow me to introduce the infamous Marcus Hellman, international aircraft thief and master of disguise."
The revelation struck Professor Newdick like a physical blow, and he staggered backward as the full implications of his betrayal became clear. Marcus Hellman, for his part, seemed almost amused by their discovery. From his position on the warehouse roof, he called down to them with theatrical flair. "Bravo, Templar! I was wondering when you might piece it together, though I must say you've arrived just in time for the grand finale." The saint's mind raced as he considered their options. Hellman was known to be both ruthless and brilliant, a man who had never been captured despite years of pursuit by law enforcement agencies across Europe. "The engine plans, I presume," the saint called back, his voice carrying easily through the fog-dampened air. "Oh, my dear saint, you understand so little. The plans were merely the beginning."
What followed was a revelation that would haunt the saint's memory for years to come. Hellman descended from the roof using a maintenance ladder, moving with the confidence of a man who believed himself completely in control of the situation. He stopped just out of arm's reach, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a true fanatic. "You see, Templar," he explained with the casual air of a man discussing the weather, "I have discovered that Professor Newdick's helicopter is capable of something even its inventor doesn't fully understand. With the right modifications I have spent months perfecting, this aircraft can achieve complete invisibility to radar detection." He gestured grandly toward the machine perched above them. "Imagine the possibilities, my friend. Imagine what governments would pay for such technology." The fog seemed to grow thicker around them, as if nature itself were responding to the dark revelation.
Professor Newdick's face went ashen as he realized the true scope of what he had unwittingly created. His voice shook as he protested the criminal's claims. "That's impossible. The helicopter was designed for transportation, nothing more. I never intended for it to be used for such purposes." But Hellman cut him off with a gesture that was both dismissive and threatening. "Intentions, Professor, are irrelevant. What matters is capability, and your beautiful machine is capable of far more than you ever dreamed." The saint stepped forward protectively, placing himself between the criminal and the inventor. "I'm afraid I can't allow you to leave with that aircraft, Hellman. Too many innocent lives would be at risk." The criminal's smile grew wider, revealing teeth that gleamed white in the dim light. "Oh, but you see, Templar, I have no intention of leaving, at least, not alone."
The confrontation that followed would become legend among those few who witnessed it, though the details would never be fully recorded in any official report. Hellman, it turned out, had not been working alone. Concealed positions around the warehouse courtyard revealed several armed accomplices who had been waiting for just such a moment. The saint heard the telltale sound of footsteps on gravel before he saw the men emerge from the shadows like specters from a nightmare. "Now, gentlemen," Hellman announced with theatrical satisfaction, "I believe it's time we discuss the terms of your cooperation." But the saint had not survived countless adventures by being unprepared for treachery. As the situation deteriorated around them, he managed to maneuver Professor Newdick toward the relative safety of the warehouse entrance while keeping his eyes fixed on Hellman's every movement.
In the tense moments that followed, it became clear that Hellman's plan was far more elaborate than simple theft. He wanted the saint and Professor Newdick alive, at least temporarily. "You see, Templar," the criminal explained as his men took positions around the courtyard, "I require the good professor's expertise to complete my modifications to the helicopter. And as for you, well, your reputation for resourcefulness precedes you. I'm certain you'll prove most useful in convincing certain government officials of the value of my new acquisition." The saint's response was characteristically calm, despite the dangerous circumstances. "I'm flattered by your confidence, Hellman, but I'm afraid you've made one rather significant miscalculation." The criminal raised an eyebrow with genuine curiosity. "And what might that be?" The saint's smile was enigmatic as ever. "You've assumed that Professor Newdick and I came here unprepared."
It was then that Professor Newdick, trembling but determined, revealed the ace he had been holding in reserve. Reaching into his coat pocket, he withdrew a small electronic device that looked deceptively simple. "This," he announced with growing confidence, "is a remote shutdown system I'd built into every aircraft I've ever designed, a safety precaution, you might say." Hellman's expression changed from confidence to alarm in the space of a heartbeat. "You wouldn't dare," he hissed. "That helicopter represents millions of pounds in development costs." The professor's finger hovered over a single red button on the device. "Then perhaps you should have considered that before you stole it," he replied with unexpected steel in his voice. The saint watched the exchange with admiration, realizing that the mild-mannered inventor possessed more courage than anyone had given him credit for.
The standoff that followed was broken not by violence, but by Professor Newdick's decisive action. Without further hesitation, he pressed the button on his remote device. High above them, the helicopter's engines began to wind down with an ominous whine, and various warning lights began flashing across its control panel. "The aircraft is now completely inoperable," he announced with satisfaction. "It will remain so for at least 24 hours, and only I possess the codes necessary to reactivate it." Hellman's carefully laid plans crumbled in an instant, and without the promise of the functional helicopter, his accomplices began to lose their nerve. The saint seized the moment, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "I suggest your associates consider the wisdom of remaining in the employ of a man whose primary asset has just become worthless," he called out to the assembled criminals.
In the confusion that followed, Marcus Hellman proved why he had remained uncaptured for so many years. With the fluid grace of a born escape artist, he melted into the fog-shrouded maze of East London streets before the saint could apprehend him. His accomplices, realizing that their payday had evaporated along with their leader, scattered like leaves before an autumn wind. But the helicopter remained safe on its warehouse perch, along with its precious cargo of revolutionary plans. As the distant sound of police sirens began to echo through the morning air, Professor Newdick turned to the saint, with tears glistening in his eyes. "How could I have been so blind, Templar? How could I have trusted him so completely? My life's work nearly fell into the hands of a madman."
The saint's response was characteristic of the man, compassionate yet pragmatic, understanding yet firm. He placed a reassuring hand on the inventor's shoulder as they waited for the authorities to arrive. "My dear professor," he said gently, "genius and innocence often go hand in hand. Your crime was not blindness, but rather an excess of faith in human nature. In a world grown cynical and suspicious, that is hardly something to be ashamed of." As the fog began to lift with the rising sun, revealing the full scope of the night's drama, the saint reflected on the strange turns that fate so often took. A brilliant inventor's dream had nearly become a nightmare. But sometimes, he mused, the greatest victories were not those won through force or cunning, but the simple act of preventing disaster before it could unfold.
Professor Newdick looked up at his helicopter, still perched silently on the warehouse roof like some great mechanical bird of prey. "What happens now, Templar?" he asked quietly. "How can I ever trust anyone with my work again?" The saint considered the question carefully before responding. "You continue your work, Professor, because the world needs visionaries like you. But perhaps next time you might consider more thorough background investigations for your assistants." A small smile played at the corners of the inventor's mouth. "I believe I shall take that advice to heart. And Templar, I cannot begin to express my gratitude for what you've done today." The saint waved away the thanks with characteristic modesty. "Think nothing of it, my dear fellow. After all, what good is having a reputation if one does not occasionally live up to it?"
And so concluded another chapter in the ongoing saga of Simon Templar, the saint, that modern-day knight-errant who moved through the shadows of our world, fighting wrongs and protecting the innocent. Professor Newdick would go on to perfect his helicopter design, though he would be far more careful about whom he trusted with his secrets. The revolutionary aircraft would eventually find its way into legitimate aviation companies, where its innovations would indeed change the course of transportation history. Marcus Hellman vanished into the underground networks that spawned such men, though the saint never doubted that their paths would cross again someday. As for the revolutionary engine plans that had started the whole affair, they remained safely in the professor's possession, their potential for both good and evil a reminder that progress, like all of life's gifts, must be wielded with wisdom and restraint. The fog had lifted completely now,
revealing a London washed clean by the night's rain, ready to face whatever new mysteries the day might bring. Until next time, dear listeners, this has been another adventure with the saint, that guardian angel with a somewhat tarnished halo, reminding us all that in a world full of shadows, there are still those who choose to walk in the light.